In this tutorial, we're going to look at some other things that you can do with your list that are not strictly required to be successful on an AP, but that can save you some time and are just interesting. So here we go. First, let's talk about using and creating lists just here in the home screen. So rather than going into the editor, if you just have a short list of a few numbers, then you can make it right here by using the braces. That's the curly parentheses. So if you do second parentheses, it gives you a brace. You can now just put in numbers that make a list by typing them and putting commas in between. So there we go. We have just made a list of the numbers 1, 2, and 3. Again, the brace on the end as well. Now, if you press enter, all it's going to do is show you those same numbers without the commas. Here's the tricky thing. You haven't actually saved it anywhere. So you've made this list, but if you want to use it again, I mean, you have to either use it right now or you're out of luck. Likely what you want to do is save that list. So let's do the same thing again, but call it 1, 2, 3, and then press your store key. It's STO right over here. Gives you a little arrow. And now put it in a list. If it's a temporary thing, which often it will be, you can put it in L1, or maybe I already have something in L1 and I want to save it in L2. If you press enter, now anytime I want that list, just bring back L2 and you've got that list. It does also show up in your editor as well. So the home screen and the editor, they do talk to each other. Now that we've got, I was just trying to quit out there and my key stuck. Now that we've got that list, let's see what sorts of other things we can do with it. So what if I want to make a copy of that list? One reason I might want to do that is, let's say this is data that I have saved that I want to use for a scatter plot, meaning I want it unsorted, but maybe I also want to do something where I would like to see the numbers in order. If I sort the list, there's no undo. So if I want to take a list like this one, and if I want to do something to it, but I want to keep the original, then just make a copy. And it really is this simple. If the numbers I want are currently in L2, then I'm going to take L2, and I'm simply going to store it as another list, like L3. And you have now copied L2 into L3. So now you can fiddle with L3 all you want. It's not going to change what's in this L2 column. So if I want to sort these descendingly, I'll do stat, sort descending, L3. My copy then is sorted down, but my original is still in the order it was to start with. So just be mindful of where you're saving things, and then this can stay unsorted. Here I can do all sorts of things that I want to do with it. Sometimes there are lists you have that you may want to put in there more permanently, especially if this is your own calculator. If you have a big old list of data that you maybe want to use more than once, or you think we'll use it now, but you might want to look at it again in a couple of weeks or months, then putting it in L1 through L6, it just takes up a lot of space. You might accidentally delete it. What you want to do instead is create a permanent list for it. Two ways to do that. Here's the easiest. Get your cursor in the very top row, and if you go past L6, it's going to take you to an empty space. Here is then where, using your letter keys, you can now name your list. So I'm going to just call this list test, because we're just kind of making a test practice list here. Look at that. It shows up. You can then put some numbers into your list so that we have some data. I'm just going to make some things up. All right, so there we go. That's my list of data. This is now saved permanently. So you'll notice there's buttons for L1 through L6. There's no button for test because we made that ourselves. Now, to use this list, you can access it in your list menu. So if you press second stat, you'll see L1 through L6. You will now also see a list called test. And it's going to stay there. You have to want to delete that. I'm not even going to show you how to do it right now. You're not going to accidentally get rid of it. Press enter. It says test with a little L in front. That's an indication it's a list, and there are the numbers for our list. Now, if you do a setup editor and then go back into your editor, you're not going to see your test list anymore. It's just not there. It has not been deleted. You can bring it back anytime. If I just go to this top row again and choose test, it just brings it all right back. So it's very hard to permanently delete a list by accident on your calculator. Okay, so we have seen that you can make a permanent list. I told you there were two ways to do it. The other way is to essentially make the list here in the home screen. So I'll just make a list of a couple of numbers, maybe 3 numbers, then press the store key. And if I now type the list name here, so what if I call it 2, like TWO, because it's our second list. Whoops, I didn't have my alpha lock on. So to get the letter keys, you have to press the alpha. There we go. I've said, hey, calculator, take these 3 numbers, store it as a list that's called 2, TWO. It says, okay. I now go into my list menu, second stat, and I have a list called 2. And it's going to stay there until I intentionally delete it. So we have stored and copied lists. We have named and saved lists. Let's now, let's save list operations for last. Let's look at a setup editor custom. What if I really want to focus just on my test list I made and maybe my 2 list that I made, and I don't want L1 through L6 there in my way? You can do that. If you go to Setup Editor, but rather than just pressing Enter, you can tell it which lists you want to show up. Maybe I do want L1, but I don't want L2, L3, L4, L5, L6, but then I do want my test data. I can go into my list menu, second list, find my test, press enter. Now if I go into the stat editor, all I see is L1 and test. So that's a customizable setting. You can make it so that you only see the list that you want to see at a given time, which can make your life a little less cluttered. Anytime you want to go back to the default, just do stat setup editor, press enter, and it's going to give you your L1 through L6 back. Now, list operations. A list is essentially a number, meaning you can add to a list, subtract from a list. You can multiply and divide. We're later on going to run some tests on them and things, but at a very simple level, right now I've got these numbers in my L1. What if I want to see what it looks like if I take all those numbers and double them? It's very simple. Do 2 times L1, and now every number in that list has been doubled. Notice I didn't save this anywhere yet. So all this is doing is showing me what it would be if I doubled all of them. If I want to save that, then rather than just pressing enter, press your store and save it somewhere. So now, stat edit, I've got the original list, and here in L2 is the original list doubled. If let's say these are numbers that I don't want to just double, but once they're doubled, I want to add 6 to them. Well, you got 2 choices. You can do 2 times L1 and then add 6. Or, since L2 is already L1 doubled, you could just do L2 plus 6. That would accomplish the same thing. If you want to keep it, which I think I do, I'm going to store it as L3. And now, all the numbers in L3 are 6 higher than the numbers that were in L2. This is super handy if you're going to be doing the same calculation lots of times. Like, for example, when I'm doing a relative frequency table from a frequency table, rather than doing a division lots and lots of times, I make a list of the counts. So I'm just going to make up an example here. Let's say that I have a frequency table and I'm counting down and I see, all right, so there were maybe 20 here and then 30 here and then 50 here. So a total, 20 plus 30 plus 50, that's 100. So to get the relative frequencies, I need to take these counts and divide them by 100. Because I put it in list form, it's going to divide by 100 all 3 times at once. And just like that, I've got my relative frequencies without having to do the division 3 separate times. This is super handy when you've got a long list of things that you're just doing the same calculation over and over. That list operation can save you tons of time. It does get a little bit better though. Let's imagine that L1 represents, I don't know, some measurement, and L2 is some different measurement. And I want to take each individual entry. So maybe I want to take the first entries and add them up, the second entries and add them up, the third entries and add them up. Doing that one at a time would take a while. I mean, I would get what? 24, 24, 18.03, 15. Just let your calculator do it for you. This only works if your lists are the exact same length. If they are not, you're going to have no luck. It'll give you a dimension mismatch. But if your lists are the same length, it's just going to take the first numbers and add them together, the second numbers and add them together. I'm going to store this as L4 so we can see it. L4. So it took those corresponding entries, added them up. I chose to save it. And if I go over here to L4, right here it is with all those added up. So hey, play around a little bit. See what you can do and what you can't. When you're working with lists, the most common error you're probably going to see is one that says dim mismatch. Just so you can get a sense of that, I'm going to take my L4 and get rid of one of the numbers. So now my L4 only has 6 numbers in it. My L3 has 7 numbers in it. If I try and, say, add those together, it's going to say, wait a minute, these lists don't have the same amount of entries. That's a dimension mismatch. Never a bad idea. Do the go-to. It'll say, okay, well, yeah, that's not super helpful. But then that just means, yeah, look at my list. My lists are not the same length. If they're not the same length, then I can't do that operation with them, is what that error tells you. So like I said, experiment, and as you have more questions, if I know the answer, I'll be as helpful as I can. And if not, we can research together, figure out what's going on.